morning, Sergio.
Good morning, Rich.
Welcome to FBA, and welcome. You are the first of our FBA dialogue series with peace practitioners from the world, where we're going to look at issues of, speak to practitioners who have been engaged in peace processes in the practical sense and try to draw not only experience, but actually to learn from what you've done so we can actually continue to improve. So welcome, Sergio.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let me just introduce you very quickly as well, so everybody knows who you are. Sergio Jaramillo was the former High Commissioner for Peace in Colombia, but also very much one of the architects of the whole Colombia peace process. We'll get into that in the peace process. We'll let you speak a little bit more about that. But also you have a background within government, a longer background. You've been in the Ministry of Defense, you've been in Stratcoms, you've been in a number of functions in the government. So you do come with a lot of institutional knowledge and memory. Before we go on to the discussion, Sergio, maybe first of all also is to congratulate you. 7th anniversary of the peace agreement in Colombia. This was a major achievement at the time. I know, from my experience, it's one of the major agreements, major peace processes in the last 10, 15 years. So congratulations. How does it feel now, 7 years later?
I say that I still feel tired, actually. It was such an extraordinarily intense process from the very beginning, and it required so much attention that one is happy with the result.
Yeah. Maybe just to frame the discussion, and again, just for people who are not like us that are deeply ingrained in peace processes, generally peace processes have 5 phases, and this is generally where you have a preparatory phase, where the parties, the government or the other groups start to internally make decisions about what their positions are, what they want to achieve and stuff like that. That's the internal preparatory phase. Then it moves to more of an exploratory phase, where they check with the other sides. Can we have a discussion? Can we start to negotiate something? And then moves to what we will speak about, which is agreeing to some sort of framework agreement. How will these negotiations go forward in terms of the peace? And then the 4th phase would be the negotiations themselves. Substantively, what do we come to agreement on these things? How do we make the reforms? What reforms need to be done? What do we trade or not? And then finally, it's more of an implementation phase. But today we want to focus a little bit on the framework agreement aspects, which I think is a really important part of setting the ground for these negotiations. Yeah. In that light, I'd like to ask you, maybe you could just very quickly, from your perspective, what is a framework agreement? What does it entail?
Well, let me first say, Elbridge, that a peace negotiation is really like building something out of nothing. You construct something. So if we may use that rather obvious analogy, a framework agreement consists really of the layout of the plans of what you're going to do. And if you're going to build yourself a house or a building such as this one, you wouldn't call in the builders and get the lorries full of bricks without actually having a plan that more or less showed you where you're going to put where. And that is what we did. It is actually not so common to do it in such a structured way. No. Which is to have, we went through exactly the phases you just described. We had exchanges through a back channel first, which led to a series, after a year and a half, a series of face-to-face negotiations in secret, which lasted almost 6 months, which ended with this framework agreement, which we called in Spanish an Acuerdo General, and which basically did 3 or 4 things. It laid out the objective of the whole thing. You need to have a shared objective with the other side. So for the first time we actually agreed that this was about ending the armed conflict in Colombia. This may sound very obvious, but it isn't, because normally people speak the language of peace in general. Yes. But we said, no, we first need to end the armed conflict, and got the FARC to agree to this. Secondly, and we'll talk about that later. We agreed to a very precise agenda. That's more common. Thirdly, we agreed to a set of rules as to how we would conduct the negotiation. And this may sound like, a very dry subject, but again, these are the kind of things that make negotiations work. For example, agreeing to only communicate jointly the processes, the progress that is made at the table, so that you don't have different versions and people. I mean, today they will be treating and saying we did this. No. Anything about what we've achieved will be done through. That was already in the rules of the original framework agreement. And lastly, and we'll perhaps talk about this later, what I think actually is most important is, in a way, already kind of pre-establishing the sequence as to how all of this would roll out later in the implementation phase. So with that, it's still very, very hard to negotiate the substance, but you already have the parameters, you already have the sequence, you already have, to a great extent, the trade-offs that show, perhaps this time we do have a chance at success.
Mm-hmm. So you come to Havana now, they've agreed, the back channel has worked, it's brought you to Havana. Can you talk us through that a little bit? What were the challenges there?
Yes. So the first thing I will say is that we prepared very, very thoroughly for everything we did. We even put together a group of international experts to support us with experience from other places. We had Jonathan Powell, who had done Northern Ireland, Bill Urey from Harvard, who spent his life working on negotiations, Joaquin Villalobos, who had done as commander of the FMLN guerrillas the Salvador negotiations, Shlomo Ben Ami, the former Israeli foreign minister, that had done Camp David too. And from successes and from failures, you always learn. So, for example, the British and Jonathan, they had in early '98, they agreed to something they called the Propositions on Heads of Agreement in January of '98. This was very important because that actually has the structure of like a framework agreement. It enumerated the subjects and the headlines, which then 4 months later was turned into the Good Friday Agreement. And here's a key thing, it contained also the key principle which was already present 5 years before in the famous Downing Street Declaration of John Major, which is acknowledging that the future of Northern Ireland would depend on what the people of Northern Ireland decided, the principle of consent. So with that in there, you already kind of have a lever around which you build everything else. It is the people who are going to decide. And so when then they go into what in effect were very compressed negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement, because this all happened in actually quite a short period of time, they already had this structure. Now we heard about this whole experience firsthand from Jonathan, and so we used that and some other examples to create our own framework. So going back to Havana, before we actually sat with the FARC, we already thought, okay, what would a framework agreement look like for us? What would be the issues? How can we structure this? And when we went in the first meeting, I actually had in my pocket a copy of what we thought the framework agreement would look like, but I obviously didn't pull it out of my pocket because that is bad tactics. We sort of talked to them for a few days and said, about various things, and then after 2 or 3 days of discussion said, well, look, why don't we think about putting this into some kind of framework, some basic thing, and then slowly started saying, well, look, why don't you have a look at this? And then obviously they started saying what they thought, but it is exactly this idea of creating a structure that holds the process. And in many ways, I think that was the key to our success.
So the structure that holds the process, but the FARC were amenable to this directly, almost. They also needed a structure, or
well, I mean, it was a joint endeavor, because we were sitting in this safe house in Havana,
yeah,
a big, not particularly pretty, huge kind of stone house
yeah,
on overseeing a lake, which had been owned by a nephew of Batista, and we were sitting there literally face to face. There were only 5 people on each side, with, and we can talk about this in a moment, a Cuban and a Norwegian diplomat who were present. And what ended up happening was that we started exchanging proposals and suggestions, but then we got into something that often happens in such situations, which is a kind of ping-pong game. So I give you something and you give me something back and whatever. Yeah. So one stage we stopped, and developing an idea of Bill Urey, who was one of the people who was advising us, we said, look, why don't we work on a single text, what diplomats call a single text, which is that instead of going back and forth, we will jointly write the text. The origins of this idea, by the way, this is a long story, but they go to Camp David I, where it was slightly different. It was President Carter going with a single text to the Israelis and to the Egyptians. But what we did is we asked the Cubans to put up some whiteboards. And instead of exchanging proposals, what we started doing was jointly writing on these whiteboards the headlines and of the framework agreement. And after a few weeks of doing this, we got more and more whiteboards all around until you actually had the whole agreement there all around you.
Ah, okay.
And later, by coincidence, I remember reading in the New York Times, because the Americans were negotiating with the Iranians the controversial Iran deal, and I remember reading that the Undersecretary of State, Wendy Sherman, who was doing that, said, well, what ended up happening is that we found ourselves in this hotel in Lausanne, I think the Beau Rivage, going around with this whiteboards on wheels, because that was the only thing that worked. And I thought, we got ahead of you. We
had done that already.
We had done that already. But again, these are things that look like small technical things, but they're the things that make it happen, make it possible. This is actually what's very important, to learn from other people, other people's experience, and pick up lessons. I myself am a big believer in lessons learned. So long as you understand that each conflict is different, that you cannot just mechanically take from here and apply there, that's obvious. Yeah. But inevitably, you run into similar problems, similar situations, and you can try and see, what did others do? How can I learn from what others did, and how can I apply it here? And we did a lot of that in our own negotiations.
But just the framework agreement itself, what was the logic of it, behind it? What was it? How was it built? How was it structured? What was it driving towards?
So, first we had to agree, what is this about?
Yeah.
And so the first point was to agree that this was actually ending the armed conflict. And interestingly, the FARC had never agreed to this before, to this kind of language.
No.
Because, among other things, it implied that, if we're ending the armed conflict, you're going to disarm, and this is the end of the FARC as we know it. And so we agreed to that, and we also agreed that this was about ending the conflict, but also to creating conditions for a long and lasting peace. So that has two implications. The first is that ending the conflict itself, the armed conflict, is not peace. That this is a phase that comes afterwards. But secondly, that the things that we agreed to, that we're going to agree to, are the things that you need to do to build peace. and especially to guarantee, in the language of transitional justice, to guarantee non-repetition or non-recurrence. Because it's precisely what you want to do, not just end the conflict, but make sure that you don't have a continuation of it later on, or new sources of violence, and which is always the risk, and has partly happened in Colombia. And so that was the logic, and we agreed to it. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is you need to be very careful about the agenda of what you're going to negotiate. And in this case, we had 5 concrete points, which were very quickly the issues of rural development, issues of political participation, of security and disarmament, issues linked to drugs, and to victims and victims' rights. So it was a very concrete agenda. So this was a very big contrast with what had happened in the past, where there was massive impossible agendas with all possible subjects. And the reason why we could have such a concrete agenda is because we always related it to the idea of ending the conflict. And we said to FARC, okay, doing something like rural development is a broad thing, but we understand that unless we do this, unless we integrate the peripheral areas of Colombia, unless we create conditions that are different, the likelihood of violence continuing is greater. So this is something we can talk about. So it gave a certain logic to this, to this agenda. Now, as important as to what's in the agenda is what's not in the agenda. So when people saw that you didn't have things that were frankly crazy and undemocratic, as had been agreed to before, like the FARC historically had issues about the, for example, they wanted to change the Colombian Congress from a bicameral to a unicameral thing, God knows why. But you say, look, this is not something that we need to discuss to end the conflict. This is something that if anybody thinks is a good idea, as part of a democratic discussion. Yeah, exactly. And you have to do this as a political party. So this is the second thing, being able to sort of agree to what's in, what's not, and to give it a certain logic. Then, as I was saying, if you actually think about it hard enough, the structure of that agenda already reflected the interests of both sides. And I don't much like necessarily the expression trade-offs, because it gives the impression that you're giving something to get something back, whereas in fact, from the point of view of the government, all of those things were things the government wanted to do. Okay. But you saw that there was there enough for both sides to be able to move forward. So even though you're only enumerating or writing the titles of the subjects, and with some subtitles we had, because we didn't just have the headlines, we also had some subtitles that said, okay, we're going to talk about rural development, that means we're going to talk about issues of access to land, we're going to talk about issues of particular kinds of programs we're going to need in various regions of the country, and so forth. But in a way, the deal was already there. It needed to be developed. Now, of course, you can fail in doing this. For example, on the issue of victims, which is probably the biggest innovation of the Colombian negotiations, was to have, for the first time in a peace agreement, a point about victims' rights. And that meant, obviously, that there would have to be a discussion about justice, including justice for the perpetrators. You can certainly fail in those negotiations. Yeah. They turned out to be the hardest thing to negotiate later on. But at least you already have the structure. So that's the next point. But then finally, and very, very importantly, the framework agreement already had the sequence of how things were going to play out. And what does that mean? It means that in point 3, which was the point that was called ending the armed conflict, which included the points on FARC disarmament and on security guarantees. As we say technically, the introduction, the chapeau to the point, said that this was a comprehensive and simultaneous process. Simultaneous, very important adjective. And then it said at the bottom of that point that would start with the signing of the agreement. So immediately you already establish a sequence, namely that once you reached a final agreement, a comprehensive agreement, which was a development of this framework. It's like filling out this,
The headlines.
the headlines and putting in the meat on the bones. Then there was a commitment already from both sides to start implementing immediately. And because we had also said to FARC, and we had agreed, that there could be no political participation of FARC unless they disarmed, because the kind of most sacrosanct principle of the negotiations was to expel violence from politics. So you cannot be under arms and participate in politics, as it happened in the 1980s in a failed peace process. Then later on, fast forward 4 years, when we actually got to the final agreement, the FARC disarmed very, very quickly. Nobody thought this would ever happen. Why? Because there was a commitment to start disarming as soon as the agreement was signed, and if they wanted to participate in elections, they also had to have disarmed. So everything worked out. Contrast that with, for example, something you know well, like the agreement that the US signed with the Taliban, the so-called Doha Agreement of February 2020, from the point of view of the sequence, which is also a kind of framework. It has 4 parts, as you remember.
Yeah.
Commitment by the US to withdraw, commitment by the Taliban to work on counterterrorism, which was quite extraordinary because it was the US treating the Taliban already as a kind of sovereign that's going to give them guarantees, a commitment to start intra-Afghan talks, and a commitment to a ceasefire. But what does that agreement actually say? And this is the killer move. This is what almost guaranteed the failure of those talks. That agreement says that each of those 4 points has its own timeline, and this is the killer phrase, that the first 2, withdrawal and counterterrorism, pave the way for the other 2. So the Taliban knew from the beginning that the only real thing in that whole agreement was that the US had committed to leaving in May of 21, and that the other things would come afterwards and they could just discuss generally, but there was no commitment for these things to happen simultaneously. And there's something very interesting happened, and if you actually have an eye for these things, which they look like they're technical, but they're not. They reflect intentions, and they reflect a certain correlation of forces. Because the US Special Envoy at the time, Zal Khalilzad, had been insisting throughout that all these things were interdependent, and he kept saying that later. Yeah. And he actually tweeted in 2019 that, following actually a principle that we used in Colombia, which is fairly common, which is the famous nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So nothing is going to be counter-valid unless everything is there. So each side knows that they're getting what they need. Yes. He even said that, but then all of that was forgotten. And so when the intra-Afghan talks actually start, which, as you remember, which were supposed to start 10 days after the signature of the agreement, but actually with the whole issue of prisoners that the US committed to and so forth, was very drawn out and really only gets going in September of 2020. I was actually advising them along with Jonathan Powell, the Afghan delegation. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think there were opportunities. A negotiation was structured in Qatar, but the Taliban always knew that all they had to do was wait out, sit out the US, wait for the deadline, pretend they were negotiating. And all of that is because that was built into that original framework. And that was the decision of the US. So this is why linking or delinking, see, in our case, to use those 2 examples, in our case, what we did was we linked the political side of the agreement to the military side, and we made one depend on the other. If the military side is not working, the other one is not going to work either. What the Americans did is that they delinked the military side from the political side, and thereby almost killed the baby before it was born of negotiations.
The reason I take this one up again, Soji, is because, of course, you are a government. You're negotiating with the rebel group. As a government, you have different conditions. You have a legislature. You have institutions that you need to respond to, that you need to report to. But not only that, you also have international conventions that you've signed up to, this Rome Statute, all these different things. How was it, were the FARC already understanding of that, or was this a big challenge to get them to understand, when preparing the framework agreement, that there were certain things that were not just red lines for you as a government itself, but actually the structures within you?
Yes, that's a very good question, because this is the great challenge we had. The great challenge we had is that we had to do a peace negotiation about a war that had lasted 50 years, in which the gravest crimes had been committed. Let me just remind you, for example, that Colombia was until not long ago the second country in the world with the most IDPs, with the most internally displaced people after Syria. And the number of registered victims in Colombia, including the IDPs, is over 8 million, probably nearing 9 by now. So the challenge for us was, how do you do a 21st century peace negotiation, which means how do you do a peace negotiation within the bounds of your own constitutional and legal limits, and also your international obligations, namely the Rome Statute, of which Colombia was a signatory. And this was a massive challenge, because there had been some efforts before, notably the case of Uganda, where negotiation failed, partly because of the relation with the ICC and the difficulty in managing all of that. And we knew this. But what I say is that we actually try to turn restrictions into enablers, by which I mean is that we actually said to the FARC, look, this is the situation. This is the situation. This is what the Constitution says, this is what our law says, this is what the Rome Statute says, this is what the Colombian people above all expect, so there's no way we're going to have a general amnesty here. It's just not possible. It's off the table. What are we going to do? So that was the basic framework within which we had to work. What are we going to do about that? And it took a very long time, but we, after a year of negotiations, we ended up with this thing we called a comprehensive system of truth, justice, reparations, and non-repetition, which included the tribunal I mentioned, which included the Truth Commission, which included a special unit to look for the disappeared, in addition to the reparations program that was already in place. But it was really very, very hard work.
And I've seen a lot of these mediation trainings where people think trust just means that you have to smile at the other person, and it's a lot more than that. And in terms of that, you talked about a confidential process. Can you talk us through that a little bit? Because a lot of the trust was then built in that process, if I could understand it correctly. How did you do this? Where was this? Where were these negotiations? Where did they take place? Why did the FARC agree to come and sit with you in these confidential discussions?
We first worked through a back channel. Back channels are terribly important because they allow both sides to have a better understanding at first where the other side may be, and they allow you to agree to some basic conditions as to what you're going to do. We had a back channel who was a businessman from Cali, Henry Acosta, who would travel to Bogota, travel to the mountains, hours away from Cali in his 4x4, get a message from the second in command of FARC, Paulo Catatumbo, and then he would go back to Cali, take a plane, and come to Bogota, and then pass on that message to us, and then we would reply. But interestingly, there were never kind of letters that were sent by the FARC commanders to the government. Formally, what there were letters that were written by the number 2 of the FARC, Paulo Catatumbo, to this man, Henry Acosta, and he replied in his name, but both sides knew that his letters were us, and that Paulo Catatumbo's letters were the FARC commanders.
Yeah.
And by doing this over a period of time, it actually took quite a long time, we agreed to have a first face-to-face meeting in Havana. But organizing that was very difficult because you had to agree to where you were going to have talks. The government insisted, we insisted that the talks had to be, we actually had no preconditions apart from what you might call procedural preconditions, which were we don't want to have a mediator, we want the talks to be direct, they have to be secret, and they have to be abroad. So we had to agree, okay, where are we going to do this? And then the FARC needed security guarantees. How do we know that the government is not going to snatch us? We're still in the middle of the war.
Yeah.
And so all of this was negotiated mostly through the back channel, plus a few in-person interviews on the border with Venezuela, and in Venezuela itself, actually. And then, after a year and a half of that, we finally sat down face-to-face in Havana on the 24th of February of 2012.
It's absolutely fascinating, and the point you raised there, if we take the Northern Ireland case that you just mentioned now, that the message came across in 1993, was it actually the commander of the IRA, or was it a mixture of the... I'm sure this is something you also had in Colombia with Acosta. Were some of the messages his? There's always a question of interpretation, or was that not a challenge?
Well, actually, the ball got rolling with the message that he got to President Santos, president-elect. And there is a question there as to what extent it was him, or it was the number 2 of the FARC, or it was actually the FARC. And these are sensitive issues because nobody wants to say, oh, we were the ones who raised our hand up. But actually, later on, when we really got into this very intense exchange, even though it took quite a bit of time because we were extraordinarily careful and we didn't use emails, much less WhatsApps or anything like this. The communications went hand to hand. No, then it was perfectly clear that we were getting the messages from the top FARC command, and they knew that this came straight from the president. And I, with myself involved as a person who was managing the back channel and helping to also structure the messages. And that's actually a very important point that people don't always understand, that back channels are critical, but you need to make sure that you only have one. It's very common in situations of conflict that move into negotiations, to have lots of people that come forward and say their channels. And if you think about, experiences that we both shared, like the very sad case of Afghanistan, any number of people go back and forth saying they know what the Taliban are thinking, they know whatever. Yeah. And so you want back channels you want to have just one back channel, and you want to make sure that it goes all the way to the top. That's the other thing. And both those conditions we had in the case of Colombia. And we kept it very, very tightly. The very few people, for quite a few months, but virtually nobody else knew that these communications were going on. I think that without confidentiality, it's impossible to do a serious negotiation, at least at the beginning, because it's a politically very risky thing to do for both sides, and you first need to understand where the other side is before taking the step of going public. And we had to go to great lengths to keep things confidential, the back channel was easier, although that actually was itself a challenge. I would meet with this man, with Henry. I would, book rooms in various hotels in Bogota, and we would sit there with his laptop and draft, after having spoken to the president, the message that would go back to the FARC commander and vice versa, and everything was done in this kind of very careful way. And then when we actually went to talk to the FARC at first, we went to the greatest lengths to guarantee that this wasn't known. So we wouldn't leave from airports. We had a national security directive that allowed us to leave the country without going through migration controls, because we knew the moment this breaks, there's going to be a huge discussion, and we first need to know that we can agree to the right terms if this was going to have a chance.
Just moving into the actual negotiations a little bit for a second. You have the framework agreement, you start the negotiations, it's 4 years of negotiations. Were there any incidents or times where things came up that could have derailed the process that you had already dealt with in the framework agreement?
You see, if you go by the standard wisdom kind of Harvard negotiations kind of stuff, which is, okay, start with the easier things and move on to the more difficult ones. In the framework agreement and in the secret phase, we did the exact opposite, which was, in a way, we started with the hardest point, which was to say to the FARC, we need to have a point here on your demobilization and disarmament. And we argued about this round after round. By the third round, they said, we cannot have a point on this. And we were forced to say to them, I was forced to say to them, look, okay, we now understand what you think, you understand what we think, that's it, because, we can't continue. This is supposed to be about ending the conflict. And we actually left. I left.
Okay.
And my people who were with me negotiating, my friend, thought I was completely crazy. But I said, look, there's no way. I talked to the president before. I'd asked for his permission. There's no way we can start a new peace process in Colombia without having clarity that this time is for real, that this is about ending it. And if the FARC are not willing to write this down, we cannot risk it. And so the secret negotiations became a kind of parallel negotiation where you would start developing some of the other points, but you would be working on the main bone of contention, which was this point. So that's what happened in the secret talks. So in a sense, once that was dealt with in the secret talks, in the framework agreement, and the sequence itself, as I explained before, was already built into that, then once moved to the next phase was much less problematic, and we actually left it for the end. And we began with a point on rural development. And then in that second, much longer public phase, the much harder issue to negotiate were the issues around justice. There were some other tough ones, like, for example, once we said to the FARC, we're not going to sign an agreement with you on issues of drugs, alternative development for the coca fields and so forth, and unless you commit here to break all links to wherever, and they refused. And again, that was another occasion where we were forced to say, okay, then we're not going to have an agreement. But on the whole, we didn't actually have, in that second public, much longer phase, it never came to the point that everything broke down, which it did in the secret phase because of that. And, it wasn't pleasant, but there are moments when you really have to kind of force the thing to make sure that it is real.